The top 10 African economies ranked by gross domestic product, or GDP, which is the monetary value of all goods and services a country produces. To determine the richest countries in Africa, we look at the latest data provided by the World Bank. Number 10, Tanzania. The country's GDP was last recorded at 58 billion US dollars. Tanzania's population of 59 million people is growing by around 3% annually. The country's gross national income in 2018 was 1,020 US dollars per capita, which is 500 US dollars lower than the average of the sub-Saharan Africa region. Now let's take a look at the Tanzanian workforce. Tanzania has a labor force of 27.1 million people as of 2019. The unemployment rate was last recorded at 9.7%. Agriculture employs almost 2/3 of the labor force. Roughly a quarter is working in the service sector and only 7% in industry. The country's top trading partners are South Africa, India, Kenya, China and the United Arab Emirates. Tanzania recorded a very large trade deficit of 4.7 billion US dollars in 2018. Tanzania is Africa's fourth biggest gold producer and Africa's third largest cashew grower. Cashews are an important source of income for small farmers. In recent years, Tanzania has discovered a lot of natural gas reserves, which are largely undeveloped and could reduce Tanzania's dependence on foreign oil. Spending exceeded revenue in 2018, which led to a budget deficit of 3.1% of GDP. Tanzania's government debt is equal to around 38% of gross domestic product. Looking ahead, Tanzania's economy is projected to grow by 5.7% in 2020. Number 9. Ghana recorded a GDP of 65.6 billion US dollars in 2018. Ghana's population of 31 million people is growing by over 2% each year. Ghana consistently ranks in the top 3 countries in Africa for freedom of speech and press freedom. The country's gross national income in 2018 was 2,130 US dollars per capita. Now let's take a look at the Ghanaian workforce. Ghana has a labor force of 13 million people as of 2019. The unemployment rate was last recorded at 6.7%. About 1/3 of the workers is employed in agriculture and slightly less than half in the service sector. The country's top trading partners are India, China and South Africa. Ghana recorded a big trade surplus of 5.2 billion in 2018. Its 3 main export commodities are oil, gold and cocoa. Ghana's economy grew by around 6% in 2019. That's well above the fiscal budget deficit of around 4.5% of gross domestic product in 2019. The Ghanaian government debt is equal to around 59% of GDP. Ghana's economy is projected to grow by 5.6% in 2020. Number 8. Ethiopia, whose GDP was worth 84.4 billion US dollars in 2018. Ethiopia is the second most populous nation in Africa after Nigeria and the fastest growing economy in the region. Ethiopia's population of 114 million people is growing by 2.5% annually. Ethiopia's economy is one of the poorest in the region. The country's gross national income in 2018 was just 790 US dollars per capita. Now let's take a look at the Ethiopian workforce. Ethiopia has a labor force of 53.7 million people as of 2019. The unemployment rate was last recorded at 19.1%. Almost 2/3 of the Ethiopian workforce are working in agriculture. 22% have jobs in the service sector and 13% in industry. The country's top trading partners are China, the United States and Saudi Arabia. Ethiopia runs consistent trade deficits due to small production of exportable goods. Ethiopia recorded a trade deficit of 11.8 billion US dollars in 2017, the last year for which data is available from the International Trade Center. Its government budget deficit was 3.7% of GDP in 2018. Ethiopia's government debt is equal to 60% of gross domestic product. The Ethiopian economy grew by 7.7% in 2018 and is projected to grow by 7.2% in 2020. Number 7. Kenya. With 87.9 billion US dollars, Kenya's economy is slightly stronger than Ethiopia's. Kenya's population of 53.3 million people is growing by over 2% annually. Kenya's economy grew by around 5.6% in 2019, placing Kenya as one of the fastest growing economies in sub-Saharan Africa. The country's gross national income in 2018 was $1,620 per capita. Now let's take a look at the Kenyan workforce. Kenya has a labor force of 21.2 million people as of 2019. The unemployment rate was last recorded at 9.3%. Over half of the workforce is working in agriculture, 8% in industry, and 35% in the service sector. Kenya imported goods worth $17.4 billion in 2018, while only exporting goods worth $6.1 billion. So Kenya had a large trade deficit of $11.3 billion. Kenya is exporting its goods to a variety of countries like Uganda and Pakistan. Most imports come from China, India, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Japan. The link down in the description gives you more details about Kenya's trading partners. Kenya is spending considerably more than it is receiving. In 2019, Kenya recorded a government budget deficit equal to 5.6% of its gross domestic product. Its government debt is equal to around 57% of GDP. Looking ahead, Kenya's real GDP is expected to grow by 6% in 2020, and thus considerably faster than its population. Number 6. Angola. Its GDP in 2018 was $106 billion. Angola's population of 32.5 million people is growing by over 3% annually. The country's gross national income in 2018 was $3,370 per capita. Now let's take a look at the Angolan workforce. Angola has a labor force of 13.2 million people as of 2019. The unemployment rate was last recorded at 30.7%. Imagine that. Regarding the labor force, 3 out of 10 people are jobless. Almost half of the workers is employed in agriculture and 43% in the service sector. The country's top trading partner is China, which accounts for 57% of all Angolan exports. Exports represent 21% of GDP, and nearly 97% of all exports consist of mineral fuels including oil. This in turn means that the Angolan economy relies heavily on oil exports and the underlying commodity price. Thanks to oil, Angola recorded a trade surplus of $25.6 billion in 2018. Nevertheless, Angola suffered a budget deficit in 2018 equal to 2.8% of GDP, and the country's debt-to-GDP ratio exceeded 80%. After contracting for 4 years in a row, Angola's economy is projected to grow by 1.2% in 2020. Number 5. Morocco. The country's GDP was $118 billion. Morocco has a population of 37 million people. The country's gross national income in 2018 was $3,090 per capita. Now let's take a look at the Moroccan workforce. Morocco has a labor force of 12 million people as of 2019. The unemployment rate was last recorded at 9.2%. The service sector provides jobs for over 40% of the workforce, while 38% are working in agriculture and roughly 22% in industry. The country's top trading partners are Spain and France. Morocco is experiencing structural trade deficits driven by the weak competitiveness of exports and dependence on energy imports. In 2018, the country's imports was 75% higher than its exports, resulting in a large trade deficit of $21.9 billion. Last but not least, Morocco had a budget deficit equal to 3.7% of its gross domestic product in 2018. Its government debt is equivalent to 65% of GDP. Morocco's economy is projected to grow by 3.7% in 2020. Number 4. Algeria with a 174 billion GDP. Algeria's population of 43.5 million people is growing by almost 2% annually. The country's gross national income was $3,920 per capita in 2017. Now let's take a look at the Algerian workforce. Algeria has a labor force of 12.3 million people as of 2019. The unemployment rate was last recorded at 11.4% and is considerably higher among the youth and university graduates as a result of the skills mismatch in the labor market. Agriculture employs only a small proportion of the labor force. 60% of workers are employed in the service sector and 31% in industry. Algeria's economy is dominated by its export trade in petroleum and natural gas. Based on 2017 data, the country's top trading partners are Italy, France, Spain, and China. Algeria recorded a trade deficit of $10.9 billion in 2017. Last but not least, Algeria's budget deficit was equal to 5.2% of the country's gross domestic product in 2018. Its government debt reached 37% in 2018. Looking ahead, Algeria's economy is projected to grow by 2.4% in 2020. And finally, the top three. In third place, Egypt. Egypt recorded a GDP of $251 billion in 2018. Egypt's population of 102 million people is growing by around 2% annually. The country's gross national income in 2018 was $2,800 per capita. Now let's take a look at the Egyptian workforce. Egypt has a labor force of 32 million people as of 2019. The unemployment rate was last recorded at 8%. Nearly half of all workers is employed in the service sector, while roughly a quarter has jobs in the industry sector and a quarter in agriculture. The country's top trading partners are Italy, Turkey, China, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Russia. Egypt imported goods worth $81 billion in 2018, while only exporting goods worth $29.4 billion, which results in a very large trade deficit of $51.6 billion. Egypt is spending considerably more than it is receiving. In the 2018-2019 fiscal year, the budget deficit was equal to 9.5% of gross domestic product. Egypt already has a lot of debt, over 90% of GDP. Last but not least, Egypt's economy is projected to grow by 5.9% in 2020. In second place, South Africa, whose economy is much stronger than Egypt's. South Africa's GDP was $368 billion in 2018. South Africa has a population of 59 million people. It has a highly developed economy and advanced economic infrastructure. The country's gross national income in 2018 was $5,750 per capita. But the income and wealth inequality are huge. According to the World Bank, South Africa is the world's most unequal country. And there's no quick way out. The World Bank predicts just 0.9% GDP growth for 2020, which, given South Africa's annual population growth of 1.3%, makes it pretty hard to reduce poverty. Growth is also dragged down by electricity shortages, with one company named Eskom Holdings SOC Limited that generates 90% of the country's electricity, posing the biggest threat to South Africa's economy, according to Goldman Sachs. Now let's take a look at the South African workforce. South Africa has a labor force of 23.1 million people as of 2020. However, the number of people who actually have jobs is significantly less because the unemployment rate is above 25%. More than 7 out of 10 workers are employed in the services sector, 23% in industry, and 5% are working in agriculture. The country's top trading partners are China, Germany, the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, and India. South Africa recorded a small trade surplus of $1 billion in 2018. Commodity prices are important for South Africa, since the country is a major exporter of minerals and importer of oil. According to the Treasury, South Africa's budget deficit will reach 5.9% this fiscal year that runs from April 2019 to March 2020. The budget deficit is projected to widen even further in the next fiscal year. The government debt, currently 61% of GDP, will therefore continue to rise. And the richest country in Africa in terms of nominal GDP is Nigeria, which is by far the most populous country in Africa. Its gross domestic product was worth $397 billion in 2018. Nigeria's population of 204 million people is growing by 2.5% annually. The country's gross national income in 2018 was $1,960 per capita, which is above the average of the sub-Saharan Africa region. However, inequality in terms of income and opportunities has been growing rapidly, resulting in high rate of unemployment, 23% in 2018, with another 20% of the labor force underemployed. Without significant structural policy reforms, Nigeria's medium-term growth is projected to remain stable around 2%. Given that the economy is expected to grow more slowly than the population, living standards are expected to worsen. Now, let's take a look at the Nigerians that are lucky enough to have a job. Well, over a third is working in agriculture. Slightly more than half of the Nigerian employees is working in the service sector, and roughly 1 out of 10 in the industry sector. The country's top trading partners are India, the Netherlands, Spain, France, South Africa, and the United States. Nigeria had a big trade surplus of over $16 billion in 2018. With an abundance of natural resources, Nigeria is Africa's biggest oil exporter and has the largest natural gas reserves on the continent. Nigeria recorded a budget deficit equal to 2.8% of GDP in 2018. Its government debt is equal to 17.5% of GDP. Looking ahead, Nigeria's economy is projected to grow by 2.5% in 2020.